One of the most spectacular buildings in the ruins of ancient Ephesus is the Library of Celsus. Archaeologists estimate that it housed 12,000 scrolls. It wasn't built until about 60 years after the Apostle Paul was there, but I think its impressive architecture just testifies to the high value that was placed on knowledge in the city. It was important to people there. Now, that library couldn't compare to the library in Alexandria, Egypt. It was built 3 centuries before Christ. It contained at least 40,000 scrolls. Some scholars say close to 500,000. So as important as knowledge like that is, Paul says that it can puff us up in 1 Corinthians 8:1. And part of that is that pride in what we know can blind us to what we don't. And so I think lots of times you find that extremely knowledgeable people can still have zeal without knowledge, because our knowledge is always incomplete, particularly when it comes to knowing and understanding the Lord. So in Acts 18:24-25, Luke introduces us to someone for whom this could have been a serious problem. Let's take a look. He tells us, now a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was an eloquent man, competent in the scriptures. He'd been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he spoke and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus, though he knew only the baptism of John. There was a large Jewish community in Alexandria that was known for integrating Judaism and Greek culture. It dates back to that time after Alexander the Great. And a famous philosopher named Philo, who lived there, argued that Moses was the true source of Greek philosophy. Now, Philo died around AD 50, so it's possible that Apollos may have been acquainted with him, might have even studied under him. And so Luke describes Apollos as eloquent or learned, literally a man of words, which probably means that he was trained in rhetoric. At the same time, he was competent, or some translations say mighty in the scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord. So he had an accurate understanding, I think, what this is pointing to, an accurate understanding of the biblical prophecies about the Messiah that pointed to Jesus. But since his knowledge only extended up to the baptism of John, it seems that he probably didn't know that Jesus had come, that he had taught, that he had performed miracles, that he died and rose again and ascended into heaven. And so his knowledge, his understanding is on the right track, but it's like outdated. Nevertheless, Apollos was fervent in spirit, it says. He's boiling over. He's zealously calling Jews to prepare for the Messiah's coming, and he's so passionate about it that he's willing to leave his home in Egypt and sail 500 miles across the Mediterranean Sea north to Ephesus in Asia. So the real question is, was he teachable? Would his confidence and his zeal keep him from listening and learning? Because we know that zeal without knowledge can harden your heart to the gospel. Paul speaks of his fellow Jews in Romans 10:1-4, and he says, brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved, for I bear them witness, here it is, that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. He goes on to say in verses 3 and 4, for being ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. Now, earlier in Romans, of course, Paul teaches that the only way for any of us to be made righteous, to be justified, is by God's grace as a gift through faith in Jesus Christ. But as Paul says here, many Jews were determined to live righteously purely by keeping the law. And so that zeal, that passion to do that, hindered them from accepting that they were unable to do so. Moses warns about that in the law, in Deuteronomy 30. He says that they'll experience God's curses for their disobedience. And you read through the Old Testament history, and you see generation after generation failing to obey and facing God's judgment, facing discipline. You get to the prophets, and they reveal that they need something new and different, a different relationship with God, a new covenant, the Messianic Savior. And so they should have recognized that Jesus fulfilled those prophecies, but their zeal for the law kept them ignorant. So how was Apollos' lack of knowledge revealed? Well, Acts 18:26 says, he began to speak boldly in the synagogue, but when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. Now, we met Priscilla and Aquila, you may remember, at the beginning of chapter 18. They were in Corinth, and Paul worked with them in making tents, and then they travel with him to Ephesus, and he leaves. So at this point, it's just them there. And like I say, Aquila was a tent maker. As far as we know, he had no formal biblical training. So you can imagine that in his zeal, Apollos could have easily dismissed Aquila as uneducated. Who are you to explain the scriptures to me? He might have even been more disrespectful toward Priscilla as a woman speaking up in a male-dominated culture. And the interesting thing here is that since Luke lists her first, he switches from Aquila and Priscilla to Priscilla and Aquila, she may have been the driving force in this conversation. Now, we're not told how Apollos responds in the moment, but it becomes clear that he was humble and teachable. In fact, his ministry is shaped by the input he receives. It directs his course, his next destination. If we keep reading in verses 27 and 28, it says, when he wished to cross to Achaia, the brothers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples to welcome him. When he arrived, he greatly helped those who through grace had believed, for he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, showing by the scriptures that the Christ was Jesus. So Apollos heads to Achaia, the southern part of Greece, specifically to the city of Corinth, right where Aquila and Priscilla had just come from. And his teaching there strengthens the believers. It reinforces their confidence that Jesus is the promised Messiah. And yet, sadly, a problem of zeal without knowledge manifests itself there too. Now, Apollos is probably not to blame, but later on when Paul writes to Corinth in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, 11 through 13, he says, for it's been reported to me by Chloe's people that there's quarreling among you, my brothers. What I mean is that each one of you says, I follow Paul, or I follow Apollos, or I follow Cephas, or I follow Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you, or were you baptized in the name of Paul? I mean, you know how this is, right? People have this tendency to take sides and argue with shallow slogans. I mean, we certainly see it in our society, right? And in Corinth, this misplaced zeal just fails to recognize that Paul, Apollos, and Cephas or Peter were all proclaiming the same gospel for the glory of Christ. So We need to ask ourselves, do I fall into this trap? Do I just align myself with someone and parrot things without genuinely understanding what the Scriptures teach? We need to be humble and teachable, as Apollos was. We need to hear the Word to keep growing in our knowledge and understanding.